International isolation aside, Russia is also facing allegations of war crimes. The International Criminal Court in The Hague is pointing towards similar allegations and possibly filing a lawsuit against Russia for war crimes committed in the ongoing fight with Ukraine. Amnesty International, which is a human rights organization, also analysed digital evidence, including photographs, videos, and satellite imagery of these attacks in Ukraine. They have verified violations of international law which could amount to war crimes. There's horror in war, loss of human lives, and guns fired with practically no rule whatsoever. But accountability exists, and so does war crimes. But what are these violations we're really talking about? Isn't everything fair in love and war, as they say? Well, not quite. Modern warfare has certain laws to keep, according to international law. It's usually referred to as the law of war by the international community. The laws of war regulate the conditions for initiating war and conduct of warring parties. The laws of war define sovereignty, nationhood, states and territories, occupation, and other critical terms of law. It was Henry Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, who began the process of codifying these customs into international humanitarian laws. But can a war be justified really? Well, according to the international standards, a war is only just if it is fought for a reason that is justified and that carries sufficient moral weightage. The country that wishes to use military force must demonstrate that there is just reasons and cause to do so. Now, as we see in modern times, wars to defend the innocent are increasingly regarded as just. The clearest example of a just cause is self-defense against an aggressor. For example, when an enemy has crossed your borders and invaded your territory. And other justifications here include assisting a friendly nation which has been invaded, when there is human rights violations, and to punish an act of aggression. Laws of war also dictate what is considered as war crimes. There are international standards for war crimes which are outlined in international treaties like the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the Rome Statute. War crimes here involves deliberate targeting of civilians, attacks that cause civilians to get hurt or die due to any military objective, attacks on civilian sites like schools, institutions, historic monuments, use of certain weapons, including chemical ones. Take cluster munitions, for instance. These bombs scatter bomblets and leave unexploded parts which pose threat to civilian lives. War crimes also requires a political context, a contextual element where the conduct of the crime happened as a result of international, non-international armed conflict. Number two, a mental element which outlines the intent of the conduct during the conflict. In international armed conflicts, victims include wounded and sick members of armed forces in the field and at sea, prisoners of war and civilian persons. War crime is divided into parts. Number one, war crimes against persons requiring particular protection, war crimes against those providing humanitarian assistance and peacekeeping operations, war crimes against property and other rights, prohibited methods of warfare and prohibited means of warfare. The International Criminal Court here can build a case by accumulating evidence against the allegations reported by the victim nations or their allies. Three principles are laid down to determine if a suspect has committed the war crimes. These are distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Proportionality stops armies from responding to an attack with excessive violence. For instance, if one soldier is killed, the retaliation can't be as big as bombing an entire city. Precaution requires to avoid or minimize the harm done to the civilian population. And distinction means differentiating between civilians and hostile populations or objects. So, for instance, if a barrack is attached which has people who no longer participate in many conflicts, then that act would be a war crime. But differentiating the two, that is civilian and military or hostile population, is difficult. ICC starts investigating when they have a concrete reason to believe that war crime is committed. They start an investigation, gather evidence and find those responsible. But the investigation is time sensitive as evidence in this case degenerates and disappears with time. So it's easier for the suspect to tamper with evidence or witnesses. The modern framework for assessing war crimes was born out of the Nuremberg trials after World War II. There, the Nazi Party officials, military officers, and German elites were tried on war crime charges. Then the international community sought to set guardrails to minimize conflicts and hold those starting it accountable. Those violations were spelt out in international treaties such as the Geneva Conventions of 1949.